The first time Permelia Rourke walked into the Antler Creek trading post wearing her good green dress, a rancher's wife let out a laugh so sharp it stopped every conversation in the room, and said loud enough for the whole store to hear that somebody ought to warn the seams before they gave out. A few other women tittered along with her, and one of the clerks looked down at his ledger real quick, pretending he hadn't heard a thing. Permelia didn't flinch, not on the outside anyway. She set her basket down, paid for her flour and her coffee with steady hands, and walked right back out into the Dakota wind with her head held high. What she didn't know was that a man was standing just outside the door, close enough to hear every word, and by the time that winter was over, he'd make the whole territory eat those words right along with her. Before we get into how the richest cattleman's son in Dakota Territory ended up choosing the woman the whole town laughed at, tell me in the comments what part of the country you're tuning in from tonight. I've had folks write in from as far as Georgia and as close as right here in cattle country, and I love seeing this story travel. Now let's get back to Antler Creek. The year was 1886, and Antler Creek was a small settlement sitting along the edge of the Dakota Territory grasslands, the kind of town that existed because cattle needed a place to be shipped, sorted, and sold. This was open-range country, meaning cattle roamed free across thousands of unfenced acres, and ranchers depended on cowboys called line riders to keep herds from drifting too far in any one direction. It was a system that had worked for decades, ever since Texas cattle first got driven north along trails like the Chisholm and the Western Trail to reach railheads in Kansas and beyond. Cattle that cost a few dollars a head down in Texas could sell for 10 times that once they reached a railhead, and that kind of profit had built fortunes for men willing to gamble on land, weather, and market prices. But by the mid-1880s, that whole way of doing things was about to be tested harder than anyone in Antler Creek could have guessed. Permelia Rourke lived just outside town with her father, Ezra Rourke, a widower who ran a small dairy operation and sold milk, butter, and cheese to the surrounding ranches. Her mother had died of a fever when Permelia was 14, and from that day forward, Permelia had taken over nearly every task in the household. She milked cows before sunrise, kept the books for her father's little business, churned butter in the cool of the cellar, and still found time to teach reading lessons to a handful of ranch children 2 evenings a week, because there wasn't a proper schoolhouse yet, and she believed every child deserved to read regardless of how far out their family lived. She taught herself bookkeeping out of a second-hand ledger manual her mother had left behind, and by the time she was 20, she understood more about running a small business than most of the men who came through Antler Creek buying supplies. She was a big woman, broad and strong from years of farm work, and Antler Creek had never let her forget it. The ranchers' wives called her heavy behind cupped hands. Boys her age had learned early that courting her would draw snickers from their friends, so most kept their distance no matter how much they might have enjoyed her company. There'd been one boy years back, named Silas Petty, who'd walked her home from a church supper and seemed to enjoy her company plenty, right up until his friends caught wind of it and teased him mercilessly for a solid month. Silas never walked her home again after that. Permelia had grown a thick skin over the years, but thick skin doesn't mean a heart stops feeling the sting every single time. That day at the trading post, the woman who'd made the comment was Verna Dade, wife of the richest rancher for 50 miles, a man named Rufus Dade who ran nearly 6,000 head of cattle on land that stretched clear to the horizon in every direction. What Permelia didn't know, standing outside catching her breath in the cold, was that Thatcher Vane had been leaning against the porch post the entire time, and he'd heard every word Verna Dade said. Thatcher was the only son of Colonel Emmett Vane, a former cavalry officer who'd come out to Dakota Territory after the war and built one of the largest cattle operations in the region through sheer discipline and a talent for reading land that most ranchers twice his age couldn't match. Thatcher stood to inherit the whole operation, and every unmarried woman within riding distance had been angling for his attention for years, encouraged heavily by their mothers, who saw in Thatcher Vane a fortune worth chasing. He'd sat through more stiff dinners and awkward parlor visits than he cared to count, listening to young women recite piano pieces and talk about nothing much at all, and he'd come to dread those evenings more than a day spent branding calves in the July heat. Thatcher didn't say a word to Verna Dade. He simply walked off the porch, caught up with Permelia before she'd gotten her wagon hitched, and asked if he could help her load her supplies. Permelia was so startled she nearly dropped a sack of flour right there in the mud. They talked for almost 20 minutes that day, right there by the wagon, about everything from the price of butter to the way the grass had grown thinner that summer than anyone could remember. Thatcher mentioned he'd been worried about how thin the range grass looked heading into fall, and Permelia, without missing a beat, told him she'd noticed the same thing and wondered aloud whether ranchers ought to be putting up more hay than usual, just in case the winter turned hard. Thatcher looked at her a little differently after that, the way a man looks at somebody who's just said something he'd been quietly worrying over himself. Permelia found herself laughing before she even realized it, the kind of laugh that came easy and honest instead of the careful, guarded kind she usually gave people in town. Thatcher rode off that afternoon with something settled in his mind that he wouldn't shake for the rest of the year. Word reached Colonel Vane before supper was even served, the way news always seemed to travel faster than a rider could carry it in a town that size. The colonel was not a warm man by nature, but he was fair, and he called Thatcher into his study that evening to ask him plainly what he thought he was doing, striking up conversation with a dairy farmer's daughter when men like Rufus Dade had daughters of their own practically lined up at the Vane gate. Thatcher told his father the truth. He said he'd spoken with more interesting women in 20 minutes with Permelia Rourke than he had in 3 years of dances and dinners with every eligible young lady from here to the Missouri River. He said she knew more about running a business than most men he'd met, and that he didn't much care what Verna Dade or anybody else in Antler Creek had to say about the shape of a woman who worked harder than any two people combined. The colonel wasn't pleased, but he also wasn't a man who told his son what to do outright. He warned Thatcher that alliances between ranching families mattered, that the Dade and Vane operations sharing water rights and grazing agreements had been discussed for years, and that a poor match could cost them more than either of them realized. He reminded Thatcher that the Dade daughter, a pleasant enough young woman named Cordelia, came with a dowry that included grazing rights along the northern creek bottom, land the Vane herd badly needed access to during dry summers. Thatcher said he understood the risk and intended to court Permelia Rourke anyway, dowry or no dowry. Over the following weeks, Thatcher found every excuse he could to ride past the Rourke dairy. First it was to inquire about buying milk and butter for the Vane ranch hands. Then it was to ask Permelia's advice on a dispute with a buyer up in Bismarck, since she'd shown such a sharp head for numbers that first afternoon. She ended up drafting the letter he sent that buyer herself, laying out the terms so plainly and fairly that the dispute settled within the week, something Thatcher's own lawyer hadn't managed to do in a month of correspondence. Ezra Rourke saw exactly what was happening and welcomed it warmly, though he gently cautioned his daughter not to get her hopes too high, given whose son was doing the courting. Permelia tried to protect her heart. She'd watched other young men flirt with her at gatherings only to marry someone else within the year, someone whose waist fit the shape the town expected. But Thatcher kept coming back week after week, through early frost and muddy roads, and he never once made her feel like she needed to apologize for who she was. If anything, he seemed to admire the very things Antler Creek had spent years teaching her to be ashamed of. He told her once, sitting on the porch steps of the Rourke farmhouse with a cup of coffee going cold in his hands, that he'd rather spend his whole life talking with her about hay prices and bad weather than spend one more evening making pleasant small talk with somebody who had nothing real to say. By November, most of the territory knew that Thatcher Vane was courting Permelia Rourke, and reactions split about evenly between delight and disbelief. Verna Dade, embarrassed by her own comment finally circling back to her, took to telling anyone who'd listen that Permelia must have bewitched the poor boy somehow, because surely no sensible man chose a dairy farmer's daughter over a rancher's polished heiress unless something unnatural was going on. Rufus Dade, for his part, was less interested in gossip and more interested in the grazing rights he'd hoped to secure through his daughter's marriage, and he made a point of reminding Colonel Vane at every opportunity just how useful that creek bottom land would become the next dry summer. None of that gossip seemed to touch Thatcher much. It weighed heavier on Permelia than she ever let show. There's a fact about frontier settlements that doesn't always make it into the history books, and it's worth knowing. In a town as small as Antler Creek, a person's reputation functioned almost like currency. It could determine whether a bank extended credit, whether neighbors showed up to help during calving season, whether a family got invited to share resources during a hard winter. Permelia understood that loving Thatcher Vane might cost her standing in that town for the rest of her life, one way or the other. Then, just as the first real snow began falling in late November, Dakota Territory got hit by the beginning of what old-timers would later call the Great Die-Up, one of the worst cattle disasters in American history. A brutal, prolonged winter swept across the northern plains that year, with blizzard after blizzard burying grazing land under feet of snow and driving temperatures down to levels that froze cattle where they stood. Ranchers across Dakota, Montana, and Wyoming lost anywhere from 50 to 90% of their herds that winter, an event so devastating it fundamentally changed how ranching worked across the American West, pushing outfits away from unsheltered open-range grazing toward fenced pastures with stored hay and windbreaks for protection. Some ranchers who'd been worth a small fortune in October were flat broke by April, their herds nothing but frozen carcasses scattered across the prairie once the thaw finally came. Colonel Vane rode out with his men in the worst of it, trying to push cattle toward the shelter of the river breaks before another storm hit. His horse went down crossing an icy gully, and the colonel was thrown hard, breaking his hip and lying exposed in brutal cold for nearly 2 hours before Thatcher and a ranch hand found him, barely conscious and dangerously close to freezing. Thatcher later said he'd never ridden so hard in his life as he did getting his father back to shelter that night, half convinced with every passing mile that he was already too late. They got him back to the Vane ranch house, but the nearest doctor was a full day's ride away in weather too dangerous to travel through. It was Permelia who knew what to do. Years of nursing her own mother through illness, along with tending sick calves and injured farmhands on her father's dairy, had taught her more practical medicine than most folks in Antler Creek realized she possessed. Thatcher rode straight to the Rourke farm through the storm to fetch her, and she didn't hesitate for even a moment, grabbing her mother's old medicine box and climbing onto the back of his horse without a second thought for how it might look to anyone watching. She packed the colonel's hip, kept his fever down with cold cloths and willow bark tea, and sat up 4 nights straight making sure he didn't slip away in his sleep, catching what little rest she could in a chair pulled close to his bedside. Colonel Emmett Vane was a proud man, but he was not an ungrateful one. When he finally regained enough strength to speak plainly, he asked to see Permelia alone. He told her he'd spent his whole life building an operation on discipline and careful alliances, and he'd let that thinking blind him to what actually mattered in the people around him. He said a ranch full of cattle and contracts didn't amount to much without people in it willing to sit up 4 nights running for a man who'd never once been kind to them. Then he told her, plain as the Dakota sky, that if his son had a lick of sense, he'd marry her before the whole territory came to its senses about what they'd been overlooking. He also told her, a little gruffly, that he was sorry for ever weighing her worth against a piece of creek bottom land, and that he hoped she'd forgive an old man for being slow to learn. Thatcher proposed that spring, once the worst of the die-up had passed and the ranchers of Dakota Territory were left counting what remained of their herds. He asked her out by the same river breaks where his father had nearly frozen to death, kneeling right there in the mud with the first green grass of the season just starting to push up through the melting snow. This time, when word spread through Antler Creek, the conversation had shifted entirely. Even Verna Dade showed up to the wedding that summer with a gift in hand, because that's often how these small towns work. Loud opinions have a habit of going quiet once a story finishes proving itself. Permelia Vane spent the rest of her years helping run the business side of the Vane Ranch, and by most accounts in the territory, she rebuilt the operation's finances faster than almost any outfit recovering from that terrible winter, because she understood markets, credit, and careful budgeting in ways few people gave a dairy farmer's daughter credit for. The Vane Ranch became one of the first in the region to invest heavily in hay storage and windbreak fencing, partly on her insistence, a decision that spared them the worst of several harsh winters that followed. Neighboring ranchers who'd once laughed alongside Verna Dade started riding out to ask Permelia's advice on their own bookkeeping within a few short years, and she never once turned a single one of them away. Ezra Rourke lived to see his daughter's operation grow into something he never could have imagined back when he was milking cows alone before dawn, and he liked to tell anybody who'd sit still long enough that the smartest thing he ever did was let his daughter go to that founder's dance in her mother's calico dress, seams and all. He passed on peacefully a few winters later, in a warm house with plenty of hay stacked up outside, having watched Permelia turn every ounce of the criticism she'd carried as a young woman into the kind of quiet, steady confidence that made grown ranchers twice her age come asking for her opinion. What folks in Antler Creek remembered and passed down for years afterward wasn't really about cattle losses or ranch alliances. It was about a town that thought it understood exactly who deserved love and who didn't, and one man who looked straight through every bit of that noise to choose a woman exactly as she was, without asking her to shrink herself down to fit anybody's comfort. If this story stuck with you tonight, stay close, because another one just as unforgettable is coming your way soon.